So my wife, Nicole, and I have been married nearly 24 years now, and we have a number of areas in which our tastes in music or art or entertainment don't quite line up. One of them are zombie movies and zombie TV shows. I like them. She will not watch them. This is not an overly surprising one. If you remember, some of you will have remembered the original zombie movie, The Night of the Living Dead by George Romero, which was, of course, very quaint by modern standards with respect to its to the way that it played out. That's the poster from it. Back in the day when it was in black and white, it was still very, very scary. I, of course, used to watch The Walking Dead back in the day. Nicole would turn the corner and I'd be watching. She'd be like, turn right around. I'm not even going to see. I thought of that because I thought about the living dead. And that's how they're described. Zombies are dead, but they're still walking around. And that contrast, that incongruity is what brought that to my mind this morning as we look at Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 3. And it begins with verse 1 with this phrase, as for you. So the message last week was about the glorification of Jesus, right? That was a decidedly uplifting and joyous message. Everybody wants to show up for that one. That's great. Well, this is not going to be that. So if you missed last week and you're here this week, that's on you, because last week was uplifting. This week, not so much. My apologies this morning if the message is depressing. I suggest you blame the Apostle Paul for that, because I'm just telling you what he has to say. But before you get too low, next week's message will start us on that triumphant path, Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, and then Easter Sunday, that will allow us to be talking about Ephesians 2, 8 to 10 on Easter Sunday morning. So I would suggest this is not the sole message to listen to, because the previous one was very uplifting, and the next ones are very encouraging. So you're not going to have to wait very long to hear the solution to the problem. The solution to what? Well, to what Paul has to say about you and me and himself. Really about all of humanity. And it is not pretty, but it's something very important. It's honest. It's accurate. It's true. So let's see what he has to say. He says, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. Here's your pop culture reference after the first one. In Star Trek, the original series, right, way back when, Dr. McCoy, played by DeForest Kelley, said, he's dead, Jim, or she's dead, Jim, about 20 times in the series, when he needed to tell Captain Kirk that yet another one of those side characters, who we don't even know their name, and they invariably are wearing a red shirt. It became a meme among Star Trek fans. Another one of these side characters has been killed. It's not one of the main people that you know, but it's another one. And Dr. McCoy kept saying, he's dead, Jim. Very, very matter of fact. As I was thinking about that this week, I looked up something and I found out that the director wanted him to say that after Spock dies in Wrath of Khan. Just to look at Kirk and say, he's dead, Jim. But he was like, it's Spock. You can't just say that now. Well, that, of course, is all about physical death, right? The end of biological life. Paul isn't talking about biological life and death, because he's writing to living people. He says, you were dead. Well, they're alive now, so he's not talking about biological life. Well, what else is there? Paul's also not talking about eternal damnation, which we call the second death, for that judgment doesn't pertain to people that are still alive biologically. So the second death is connected to the death that Paul's talking about here. but only if this death persists throughout one's life to the very end. Which brings us to the type of death Paul is speaking about here. Not biological, not eternal after biological death. Instead, it is the spiritual death in the here and now, in the midst of biological life. So Paul is talking about those who are alive, but not really. Alive, but not fully. Paul's describing a state of being that is common to humanity, to all of humanity after the fall. Not fully alive because of our separation from God. Human beings who are not in fellowship with their Creator cannot be fully the people that our Creator designed us to be. If we're disconnected from God, we will suffer for it. We must. Paul considers this state to be so harmful that he is willing to call it death. Those who assert their independence from God, those who are following in Satan's prideful footsteps, they may think themselves free. I am free. I will chart my own destiny. I am the master of where my life goes, they think. But it is not so. In reality, they are spiritually dead, even if they have no idea about it. Humanity, Paul tells us, is dead in its transgressions and sins. That people universally act against the will of God, they don't need to be taught about it, is well known. We see this in children. Children, at least they're inherently unaware that what they're doing is an affront to God, but they do it. Nobody needs to teach, right? Your 3-year-old child and your 2-year-old child to get in a fight, to take from each other. Nobody needs to teach children to behave this way. It is simply our nature. The depth and the breadth of it, of how much we accept our own sinfulness, shows just how significant it is when Paul says that they were dead. Now, of course, the past tense of the verb is what gives us hope. Hope we will see when you come back next week and we hear about it. But for now, our focus is on this spiritual death that Paul is describing. We'll learn several of its characteristics, and the first we've already had. Number 1, spiritual death is immersed in transgressions and sins. Now, there are a number of good definitions of those two terms that we could use, depending on the topic that we're talking about in connection to transgressions and sins. For our purposes here this morning, it will suffice to say that trespasses and sins are the behaviors and the attitudes that defy the character and nature of God. Transgressions and sins being in the life of someone is a strong indicator that that person committing them is at least somewhat estranged from God, because we're not imitating his character or his nature. So you were dead in your transgressions and sins. What comes next? In which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world. So here's the second truth about spiritual death. It is the way of this world. That means that most of this world's quote-unquote successful people, those who have achieved the goals of their culture, of the economy, of the governmental systems that this world operates under, the people that succeed, according to this world's definition, are for the most part spiritually dead. Most of them succeeded because they played this world's games by this world's rules to gain this world's rewards. none of which has made them one iota more alive than anyone else. The glitz and the glamour of their wealth or their fame or their power, or all three of them together, are an illusion. This world's pampered billionaires are no more alive than the billions of poor people that they look down upon. Spiritually, not one bit. Because this world's ways are fruitless. Whether or not you win at them will not impact the universal state of human spiritual death that we were born with. You already knew that. We're just reminding ourselves of it. Paul says, and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. Those who chase after the ways of this world are not free. They are actually slaves to the cruelest master of all, the Prince of Darkness. I find that many Christians now and in the past have made much too big a deal about Satan. Satan's a fallen angel, no more. Satan has power over this world's rotten systems, but no more. So Satan's example spurs on those who choose to rebel against God. But remember, Satan is limited by time and space. There's only one of him. His power is in deception. He cannot dictate. His power is in manipulation. He cannot control. Make no mistake, the ways of this world are Satan's forte. Do those who are spiritually dead in their trespasses and sin, do they need Satan's help to stay as they are? No. No, they do not. Humanity is capable of wallowing in rebellion all on its lonesome. That it is also Satan's game and Satan's delight just adds insult to injury. A secondary thought before we return to what Paul has to say here is that a secondary thought, would be to consider the value of this world's ways by the company that it keeps. Now, I know that guilt by association is certainly unfair when it happens to you socially or legally. But spiritually, we ought to sit up and take notice when Satan is associated with something. Right? It's one of his things. That's not a good sign. Call this yet another reason why I continue to warn people about the prosperity gospel or quote-unquote Christian nationalism. They're trying to sell Christians on the idea that God would ever approve of his children treating their relationship with their heavenly Father as a means to gain in this world. The false prizes of wealth and power that Satan tried to tempt Jesus with, they want you to believe that this is the goal of being a Christian. Not hardly, not at all, not a bit. Back to Paul's thought, he says, all of us also lived among them at one time. Paul changes the pronoun from you to us because he freely admits that his former life of self-righteous legalism did not make him more alive or more free. He was as lost as the pagan Gentiles were and their idolatry. Now, their lives looked much different, right? Their revelry and their sexual immorality and their idolatry, and Paul with his very legalistic, very buttoned-up life. But he was no more alive than they were. And in fact, we all started here. Even those who are raised with the blessing of a Christian family and a Christian home, a church home that they were raised in. I count myself among those so blessed to have had that. But that favorable setting does not change the fundamental truth that until we are rescued by the redemption of Jesus Christ, we all belong to the category of the lost. We all had the same experience of needing to be awakened by God. Paul says, we were all gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. This will not be fully manifested in children who come to Christ at an early age, right? They will be spared much of what that would have looked like. Nor will every person who remains in darkness without the transformative power of the Spirit be a textbook case of a person who is led by their sinful cravings and desires. But in both of those cases, we're talking about differences of degrees, something that is more or less, and not about a difference of kind, because they're neither alive. Both are dead until Christ. Everyone who is not alive in Christ, more on that next week, but everyone who is not alive in Christ is dead in their own sins, and therefore is at the mercy of their sinful nature that is inherently self-centered and ultimately self-destructive. Now, some will do their best to limit the damage, but they won't be able to overcome their own nature. How could you? There are good people that we all know who don't believe in God or they don't trust in Jesus. They somehow manage to be decent. If this were enough, if this would change the outcome, we would treasure the people who are doing okay on their own. But we know it isn't enough. And it doesn't change the trajectory of their lives. It doesn't change the direction they're moving in. Now, you and me both, I would rather have a decent neighbor who doesn't know God, who is nice and polite and good to have as your neighbor, than a dangerous neighbor who's building bombs or selling drugs or who knows what out of the house right next to you, right? My wife's grandmother, God rest her soul, in Muskegon, Michigan, lived next to a meth lab. She didn't know it until the cops showed up one day and the people with the hazmat suits came. She had no idea what those fine people next door were doing. I would much rather have a nice neighbor than one that's scary. But in the end, they won't be able to overcome sinful cravings and desires and thoughts any more than the other neighbor would. Saul of Tarsus couldn't do it, and he tried harder than most. He tried hard. It didn't work. So this minority of decent people, they're not really who Paul is thinking about, because they may have issues with a false sense of security, fooling them to thinking they don't need God's help. That's a different group of people, and Paul has different words to them to remind them that no, you too need God. Instead, Paul is focusing upon the people who both don't know God and revel in committing whichever sin their heart desires. Honestly, the world has enough such people, does it not? There's quite a few. The constant stream of evil committed by people against other people reminds us daily of the brutal cost of a world where many people put their own self-gratification at the top of the list. Paul's conclusion about humanity in this state: like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. Yeah, I told you this wasn't going to be an encouraging message. I can't help you. This is what Paul has to say. We got to start here before we can move on. This is Paul's assessment of where they and he and all of us too were. And it ends in a dark place. It has to end here because this is the reality of humanity's status. To pretend otherwise wouldn't help anyone. It would actually cause harm because a patient who doesn't know or doesn't understand or won't accept that his or her diagnosis is terminal will be less compelled to seek help from a doctor. If you won't believe it, Paul's stark conclusion is designed to encourage us to seek the healing power of the great physician. So next week, we get to focus on the cure. Today, we need to ensure that everyone understands how grim this disease really is. Humanity that is disconnected from God is spiritually dead. In that place, we are controlled by our own selfish, self-centered cravings. We are following the ways of this world, leaving us mired in our trespasses and sins. From God's perspective, and that's a perspective that we need to care a whole lot about, from God's perspective, all such rebellious creatures who have turned their back on him deserve the wrath of God. It's not a close call, right? Baseball season has started. It's not a close call, one of those bang-bang plays at first place where they slow it down frame by frame and you're like, I'm not sure. This is instead the guy rounding third and the coach is like, stop, and he's going anyway, and you're like, oh man, the catcher gets the ball and he's just waiting. He's still coming. He's like, I'll wait for you to get here. That's what this conclusion is. Out by a mile. The sin of humanity, collectively and individually, has earned God's wrath. God has every right to judge such actions and those who commit them. God has every right to use the full extent of his divine justice in doing so. If God chose to wipe humanity out, given the evil that people have done, who would object and say that that outpouring of wrath wasn't fair? Fair is getting what you have earned, what you deserve. And on this topic, there's no doubt that humanity's quest to stand apart from God has been an utter failure. So that is what they and Paul and me and you were. Now, the story ending here would be a tragedy, but it wouldn't be an injustice. It would be a sad tale, but an honestly told one. Spiritual death, sinful cravings, earned wrath. That's the starting point, but it isn't the end. Not for anyone who seeks God in Christ. Even the living dead can be set free by Jesus. 3 things to take with you, all in the past tense for a purpose. We were dead in sin's cold grip. We were at home in this world, craving its self-centered desires. We were deserving the wrath of God. In a moment,